moves at an early point in my research for what became this book. A key piece of it was presented here at a conference that I'm proud to say I helped cook up the title for. And I thank Madeleine Dobie for then allowing me to take that title back some years later. When I spoke here, it was more than 10 years ago, about the beginning of the book. I was already thinking about how this dance form that everyone agrees came from New York and has been exported all over the world, riffed on, developed, exploited, grown, nurtured in every possible way, how it turned out particularly in France, and that it joined what's called the cultural patrimony, right? That it was art that was being funded, that it was happening on big stages, and that it had a discourse around it as French art. So that was sort of the piece I began with. And I just want to say that every place I speak, and I'm sort of on a book tour at the moment, I find that a different piece of the puzzle of this particular research will emerge. So sometimes I speak to audiences of dancers who get the hip-hop and the dance vocabulary part, but maybe don't know as much about France, or I have an audience that knows a lot about France and the particularities there. So I'm going to try tonight to negotiate that with you. I think I see some dancers here, but because I'm at the Maison Française, I'm going to assume that everybody knows something about France, or has some interest or investment. So allow me to try to negotiate that tonight, and then we can open up the floor later for questions and see how that will work in terms of what paths are the ones that we want to pursue more. So I'm putting the cover of this book up as my first slide, and if you look at the picture on the cover, it's a fairly recent choreography. I'll speak about it a little later. 2008, it was a commission. One student asked me one time, what's with the windmill? We're seeing high production values, we're seeing full evening choreography, we're seeing it on a big stage, and yet this would go absolutely under the rubric of what is called le hip-hop, right? So there can be some discussion about that, but in France, this is where this dance is now. It's also called urban dance, and it's really, when I say hip-hop in French, it really means dance, okay? And this is what you see. I'm just going to speak through a few slides and think about what dance makes possible. I want to think both about the specificity of dance and also about the specificity of the French context. So what is it that dance makes possible for these hip-hop dancers, now professional dancers dancing on big stages? What does it make possible for them in the French context? This is the same piece that I just showed you, Zoo. And we see one of the warm scenes, right? One of the red light scenes. There are some blue light scenes. We get a sense this piece is about energy, about alternative energy. There's a narrative, but it's really an abstract piece. It's commenting on its context, its social context, and its historical moment, but it's also doing it in an abstract way, as you can see from this particular photo, the grouping of the dancers, the beautiful dramatic lighting, etc. But in a first step, before we maybe got to this sort of choreography being the norm for le hip-hop, we went through a phase in France of what might be called, identitary dance, or dance that talked about the people who were making it or who were dancing it. And this is what is often said about hip-hop in the US. I won't show that tonight, it's really a different question. But in France, there was a gesture toward this kind of identity politics in the US. And this is important because, as probably many of you know, identity politics works very differently in France. I actually coined the term identity poetics to talk about it. It's not typical, in fact, it can be argued that it's illegal to gather statistics on ethnicity or on racial identity in France. Although in some contexts, it's now, people are trying to do it, or people are arguing for the importance of doing it, right? To think about inequality, to think about unequal opportunity is important, and so to be able to name ethnic difference, racial difference, and talk about it. But in France, it's a relatively new discourse. The Republican ideals of France focus more on universalism. Everyone should join together. On this slide, we see Laos, a young breaker. It's his stage name. And for me, this evokes something about what we might call visible minority, right? There's something about that, stating a difference, being visible on stage as a minority performer. And by far, the people dancing hip-hop in France do represent minorities. I want to contrast this with what we call the Anglo-Saxon model. This is actually a form that I received at a dance event in Greenwich in London, and in which the audience was being asked to identify, right? What is my racial background or my racial identification? And what's interesting to me about this form is not just that it represents the very different way we think about difference in Anglo or American contexts, but also that the boxes that you are to check or your identification are very different in Britain from those we have in the US. Can you see the form? Not very well. It's very rich, it's very layered, but for Britain, okay? And so it's targeting, in a way, obvious groups, okay, that you have in Britain. And our boxes are very different, right? So our notion of the way you would identify or your options for identifying are very different. Okay. Plus the fact that they're gathering this information and they're gathering it at a dance event. Okay. I find this really telling. So let me take you through a narrative of one good example of a dance company. Company Choreographies. They started in Montreuil. It's one of the suburbs of Paris. This is a photograph, not from '93, but with the 93 on it because that's the postal code. So a lot of times there's an identification of this is my banlieue, this is my suburb, right? And what you see here is early days where basically two choreographers, who you'll see again, are working with a group of kids in basically a housing project. After school or weekend, and they're making, classic early hip-hop gestures, right? You see the Egyptian kind of arm pose, you see the posing, right? You see kind of wild style, early New York hip-hop style here. And just to give you some context, just down the road from the place where this company taught these classes and where I took class also with these teachers, you have in Montreuil the highest percentage of Malian immigrants outside of Mali. Okay, so after Bamako, the biggest agglomeration of Malians is right here in Montreuil. Okay, this is a day I was walking through Montreuil and happened to see, the phone booth full of Malians in traditional garb phoning home. I think it was Laïd Kabir or one of the big Muslim holidays. So this is sort of the context around it. Now, in a very few years, this company is suddenly doing concert dance, right? They have commissions, they're presenting work on stage. This was an early piece, Epsilon 2001, that was an evening length piece. And you can see from the image that some of the early days of hip hop remains. There's some posing, there's some graphics, right? But they're already thinking choreographically, and they're thinking about something that I call dance poetics, right? How are we going to talk not just about ourselves, about our neighborhood, but say something else, say something different and say something differently, both through dance. Here's the process. In this dance class, in this urban housing project in Montreuil, here's Stephanie Nataf teaching class. And you see this arm movement called the Egyptian, focusing on that. Teaching a really beginner class, but almost like a master class. There was room for us to experiment. There was room for us to try out steps. There was room for us to put things together, take our own time. So it wasn't the classic studio class of 5, 6, 7, 8, here we go, we're going to just reproduce steps. Right? And this arm movement, which is taught in class with some precision, then becomes an arm movement that can be used to say other things, many different things, in fact, in a choreographic vocabulary. Here it's a joke, right? Here it's a bird, it becomes the wing of a bird, or fish, or something very fluid. Here's José Bertogal, the other co-founder of this company, teaching class, right? And there's certain elements to it that remind me of modern dance. There's a certain approach to dance which is quite serious. And more, as important, okay, in this context in which I'm speaking about it, we have here a student who I worked with and followed and interviewed for the book, whom we protect with a pseudonym, so we call her Aisha, who is from a Malian family and who is sneaking out basically to take hip-hop dance class in Montreuil because she's super interested in it. She wants to be a dancer. She wants to dance hip-hop. She knows this company is good. She's really interested in them. And when I ask her, you know, about it, she says she doesn't tell her family that she goes to hip-hop dance class, right? So there's still a kind of an interesting rebellion going on there in this piece, in this teaching and in this context. And I want to call up now a different example. So Yifun Chen, who's actually Belgian and lives in Brussels, who represents a slightly different school. Sometimes we think about a French school of hip-hop, you know, but also I like to call it Francophone because we see it in other Francophone contexts, but particularly in Francophone Belgium, where there was funding for hip-hop dancers, etc. So Yifun really, what does hip-hop make possible for her, right? Why is she dancing hip-hop? She came from an immigrant family who left Cambodia after the genocide, during the genocide. She grew up learning the Cambodian traditional dance for women. And when she was already 17 or so, saw some breakers and loved what they did and wanted to join them. And they said, go practice. And she did, and she came back and started touring with them. So I would say Yifun is one of those dancers who hasn't lost the roots aspect of her hip hop. She does battles, she's interested in you know, the kind of party and DJ and battle culture, but she's also a choreographer and she does choreography you know, on the big stage. I want to show you a bit of choreography now, but before I show it, of her work, I want to say something about the piece that she did. The piece is called Apsara. It's from 2008. I saw it in Paris. And it's a solo piece, an evening length piece, so a little over an hour. And in the piece, I think there's a lot of autobiographical elements to it. She dances some of the steps, some of the vocabulary from the Cambodian traditional dance. She also, there are some passages of breakdance. And she uses these vocabularies to narrate her own story, if you like, to think about her transition from one culture to another, her family's transition, and how hip-hop helped her then integrate in a way into Europe, join a global phenomenon that was also you know, promoted and prized in Europe. So in this piece, there's an incredible scene, extremely tragic, where Yifun comes forward on the stage. She brings a chair with her and she says, "Hello, bonsoir, je m'appelle Yifun, my name is Yifun. Je voudrais vous raconter mon histoire. I would like to tell you my story." She puts the chair down and sits in it, and she speaks no more. She uses gesture to evoke the incredible history, the horrendous history of the Cambodian genocide. It is extraordinary. There is no doubt that you can tell what she's saying, what she's talking about, if you like. She's doing it gesturally. And by doing so, she's pointing toward the inadmissibility, if you like, the incredible difficulty of speaking about this history. She's also pointing out that there hasn't really been, you know, we're only now at the point of the trials, right, of the surviving members of the Khmer Rouge trial in The Hague and also in Cambodia. So thinking about the way in which gesture or dance or art performance in general can raise issues which are of great difficulty in public discourse. After this very moving scene where she really enacts, in a way, the genocide, there's a scene of comic relief. It really makes you think about Shakespeare, and the traditions of the stage where it was common to have a comic scene follow a tragic scene. I'm going to show you the comic scene now. She changes garb, she dresses up as a hip-hopper, she's clearly working on her moves, and I want you to see how she locates herself in that. Let's see. I want to also now think about another piece by Stephanie Natel. This is called Zoo, and it was a commission for one of the great festivals, the summer festivals in France. There's no question that this piece is both high production level, for a major stage, but at the same time trying to think about the lives of its dancers and yet put them onto that big stage, thinking about everyday life, thinking about basic questions relating to citizenship, participation in public space, etc. It's called Zoo. This first slide shows a scene which is really set in the metro, right? And at a particular moment, we see a banner of text flickers across the screen, like because of en raison de mouvement social, right? So there's a strike, based on social politics. So it's thinking about the moment of its creation and commenting on that. But it doesn't lose its hip-hop roots. There are some moments where everybody dances together, there's unison dancing, there's frontal dancing, to the audience. It's not, out of the choreographic handbook, right? And although Stephanie Nataf herself says, I don't care if people call my work hip-hop or not, she remains very connected also to that world. This beautiful image, which is on the poster, thank you for this event, I speak about this particular dancer in my book and say, what might it mean for him coming up, so-called amateur dancer, okay, in France that means you don't have a diploma, right? You may be engaged as a professional, you may be performing on a big stage, but you're seen as a self-trained person. What does it mean for him to be, on this image on the cover of my book, etc.? What does it make possible for him? Not just, I would argue, the identity politics of standing on stage, being visible, being a visible minority, but something more, going beyond that, and representing something poetically, right? Speaking perhaps about himself by speaking about something else. There's a scene about the windmill and alternative energy, about the turbine. There was also a certain amount of choreographic work done to go and observe this in the field and to think about bringing that energy onto stage, the cool energy of electricity, the warm energy of work. This is part of the piece. With a kind of civic notion attached to it. A hip-hopper is a citizen, lives in the city, right? Lives in the nation and contributes something to that. And in hip-hop, this is reinforced by the fact that hip-hop dancers early on got a certain status. It's called intermittent de spectacle, the option to have accessibility to unemployment insurance, this kind of thing, that dancing is taken seriously as a civic activity, if you like, in France. We can talk about this more and develop this in a minute. I just want to conclude this part here by talking about a very more recent event that, again, I think shows both the civic engagement of hip-hop. We're thinking about hip-hop association, who are teaching the dance, who are getting often children to dance the dances. There's a pedagogy there, but they're also often working toward integration, toward citizenship, as well as toward creative self-expression in France. This was a project that was organized at La Villette. Many of you know the venue in Paris, a big public park, a series of theaters, music school, etc. Lots of performance going on there. And it was called Stravinsky Hip Hop. And it was a commission to Farid Berki, one of the earliest hip-hop choreographers, again, an autodidact, a self-taught guy who came up practicing in public spaces, in train lobbies and shopping malls, who has become a leading choreographer. He worked with 70 young kids, none of them dancers, in the region, and they staged a version of Le Sacre du Printemps in 2013, right, for the centennial, with these 70 kids, a live orchestra, full orchestra playing for them, etc. So what is dance doing there? Clearly a civic role, a really important role. Erasing that divide between, if you like, high culture and low culture, erasing the divide between popular culture and the venues, in which orchestras play. Really working hard and thinking about issues of integration, culture, inculcating in kids, something that is going to take them onto a big stage, even if they're not dancers, even if they're not training in that field. It's an incredible history, this arc from early days of hip-hop to what's going on now. I'm going on tomorrow actually to see an important hip-hop festival, so I can't tell you what's happening this week, but next week I can tell you what's happening. I see some smiles here, maybe you also know I'm going to Surin Festival, anyway. So that's what I wanted to just present as a beginning today.
I wanted to begin just by saying 3 short things, and then I have some questions for Felicia, and I'm sure that you do too. The first thing I wanted to say is that I wasn't supposed to say this before, but now I could reveal it to Felicia after the fact, that I was actually on the committee of the Society of Dance History Scholars that selected her book for the big prize this year. So when she said, "Oh, you know, I'm going to be talking about my book," I read it very carefully, and in fact had drafted the citation for the book. And I just thought, because I said in this pretty much what I would like for you to know about this book, for those of you who have not yet read it, I really highly recommend it. And this is all heartfelt. It's a lovely book, and it does some amazing things. Felicia McCarren's fascinating study of l'unequal in France reveals the tensions between globalism and nationalism in official cultural policy, as well as in the popular responses to it. The research for this book spanned a decade and was informed by conversations in the Ministère de la Culture, in hip-hop classes in the Parisian banlieue, and in the concert halls of contemporary dance. McCarren draws on her extensive knowledge of French cultural policy, on performance theory, and on embodied experience as a dancer, both outside and inside of North American and French understandings of movement and identity. She convincingly argues that le hip-hop has much to teach us about what we thought we already knew about global cultural flows and the specificity of communities that see dance as a politically potent language. Her nuanced and theoretically informed work brings to French studies a critical perspective on the concept of universalism, but it also complicates the ways in which Black expressive culture has been framed in US accounts. Her analysis is structured by considerations of the politics, poetics, techniques, and technologies of contemporary dance, and while it's deeply embedded in this particularly French phenomenon, it will speak to students of dance across a globe currently rife with questions of which bodies can move, where, and how. That last sentence, now I suddenly realize that I get goosebumps myself as I say it out loud, because you know, one of the things that when Felicia said that we would be talking about this book, this is a very intense moment, of course, to think about that in France and in the world right now. So we'll certainly get to that question. So the first thing that I want to tell you is what I just said, which is that this book is quite remarkable in its integration of very grounded knowledge of French cultural policy, but also integrates theory in a way that is really never feels, you know, academic books oftentimes, the way that theory is brought into a conversation with more practical, either close reading or political observation, sometimes feels kind of wedged in, but this book really convincingly draws theory into the conversation in ways that are very, I think, extremely illuminating and very important at this moment, obviously. The second thing I wanted to say is not actually about this book, but I can't help but say it. For those of you who are in the field of dance studies, you may be aware that last night Randy Martin passed away. Randy Martin was extremely important dance theorist and writer and extraordinary person. He wrote a very important book called Critical Moves, in which he has a chapter, a very interesting chapter, which is precisely about the politics of multiculturalism and hip-hop, but in a US context. And it's an ethnographic chapter of, it begins, as he often does, with this sort of light, comical, self-referential moment. He was living for a brief time in Southern California and started to take hip-hop aerobics dance class for exercise with a certain amount of, you know, in a predominantly white community, and he with a certain amount of self-irony and self-consciousness about what he was doing, but wrote about it in a way that was generous of spirit, not only to himself, but also to the other people in that class, and obviously drew out some of the maybe troubling ways in which certain kinds of cultural appropriation can happen, but also was still anxious to look for spaces of hope or possibility, political possibility. And I recommend that to you as well. I thought I would just for a second read to you a couple of lines from that essay. To reimagine nation along more fully multicultural lines. He troubles this term multiculturalism, as does Felicia, asks really what that means. And he's talking about it in a US context where it has quite different connotations and quite a different history. To reimagine nation along more fully multicultural lines, I propose a conception of a body not as a stable presence already available for appropriation, but as a composite entity mediated across a conflicted space of the imaginary and the performative. Dance both appears in the conjuncture of imaginary and performative spaces and puts the constitutive features of a composite body on display. And I can't help but say at this particular moment, as we're feeling the loss of his bodily presence, that there's something not only politically interesting, but also just comforting, thinking about the ways in which the body is not necessarily the thing that we think it is, the sort of contained thing that we think it is. I think that may lead to some interesting questions to ask to Felicia. And then I just wanted to say briefly, Madeleine mentioned that my own work in dance began in Brazil. And my writing on dance has largely been about African diasporic dance traditions, and my familiarity with sort of the global manifestations of what we think of as hip-hop as a dance phenomenon. My experience largely took place in Brazil, and when Felicia was showing that, said indeed when the history of the term and of the forms, both musical and choreographic, are talked about, we often talk about it as sort of situated in New York City, in the Bronx, at a certain historical moment. But of course, there are things that also kind of recomplicate that history, including even those gestures that we think of as sort of Egyptian hieroglyphics. And when I was in Brazil, of course, many times young people would say to me, there are certain hip-hop moves that they would identify as the choreography, the divine choreography of the Yoruba divinities, that are danced in African religious ceremonies, and they would identify them as a certain move was Oshala, the divinity of creativity. And the interesting thing about that is Oshala is a divinity can either be a child or a very, very old man, and somehow the oldness of the notion that some of these choreographic moves were very old actually made them very new. There was really a way in which it was a recreation of historical time, and of course also of cultural histories, because even as they would say, oh, well, that's Oshala, that's an African move, at the same time there was a very clear understanding that hip-hop choreography was really something that was emanating from the US, and that then they would have to make these dancers would make very conscious, historically situated understandings of their own political relationship to African Americans in the United States and their political relations to them. So, and the other thing, of course, that came up a lot in Brazil, for those of you who have any familiarity with Brazilian dances, that capoeira, many people sort of hypothesize that capoeira as an Afro-Brazilian choreographic form might also have influenced hip-hop. So of course, any place I say that because my sort of point of entry is through Brazil, but of course, any place in the world you go, and as I said, I think also then it gets complicated because of Asian martial arts and how they, all of it, and there are many, many, many ways in which there are more complicated ways of thinking about those histories. And as somebody who's written dance history and dance ethnography, I think one of the things that's interesting is sometimes the popular histories, the ways that people talk about these things, maybe you're not historically correct, but they're still interesting. It's interesting that people see these histories or read themselves into histories in ways that, you know, perhaps the genealogies are not, maybe that's not really the way it happened, but it's interesting that people are able to read themselves into those stories. So that's one of the things that I think, for me, it's interesting to think about as we look at these very, very potent places where dance forms are being performed out of context with new contextualization and new ways of thinking about how all of that relates to history. I found that amazing, that the piece that you showed, and that narration of a history, one's own personal embeddedness in a history that you wouldn't have thought would be contextualized within hip-hop, you know, as a form. So it's quite astonishing. But having said all of that, I did have some questions for Felicia. So you mentioned that you sort of coined the term identity poetics, which I found very compelling. And I was wondering if your differentiation of US identity politics versus French identity poetics, if you would mind just elaborating a little bit on it?
Yeah, thank you, Barbara. Very moving moment, yeah, tonight. Right, so I think, you know, there's a lot of work on hip-hop all over the world that thinks about it as an embodiment and as an empowerment, and I find these arguments really convincing. But I think in France, because there's one remove, if you like, from the origins of the invention of this form, there's a citation that's going on, right? So they're referring to, you know, I would say African-American, Latino, you know, neighborhoods from which the form comes, and even though they're not that, they're adopting that, right? So there's a kind of an extra step there. So I think of that as poetics because I think dance is like allegory, right? Not just saying differently, but saying something different, and that ability to say something different, which is actually in France to say we are different, right? We're going to both be part of a universal republic and integrate, but we're also going to start talking about articulating our difference, right? I think that poetics is a useful term. It's used in a lot of ways. It's used in a lot of ways for dance, but I'm mostly just thinking about it in that sense. I grew up in Chicago, and there was a discourse, there. Jesse Jackson led, a very powerful movement about I am somebody, right, for minority discourse to, as we often say, come to have a voice or come to have a presence, come to be represented politically, right? And in our culture in general, we think we must think about groups, community groups, ethnic groups, because we have to address the past of certain exclusions, right? So those labels and identifications are useful to us. It doesn't happen so much in France, and it doesn't happen quite that way. So I would argue that instead of saying in France, I am somebody, what the hip-hoppers are kind of using hip-hop to say is, I can be anybody, right? I don't have to be the person that I am being assigned to be, right? And a lot of the discourse of hip-hop is for people to say, I am not just of the suburbs, right? I am not just of this minority group. I can be anything. I can have the same metaphorical or allegorical power of expression that any artist can have, right? And this is actually a taking of rights, right? Or asking for rights or demanding of rights in the French context. So not only that we have this, I'm equal, but also, I can be multiple, right? I can be many things. There's a charge put on these dancers and on hip-hop to be multicultural, to represent multiculturalism. I didn't show you an incredible quote by the EU Minister of Culture a few years back, saying, we have problems in Europe, we're going to address them via dance, okay? It's almost unimaginable for us to think about dance having that charge and having that potential. But it does carry that charge, and it does, I think, really try anyway to respond to it. So, very powerfully, beautifully also.
This is so self-indulgent because at first when Madeleine said, I can't resist mentioning your ukulele habit. I said, no, but now I'm going to mention it, which is, I did a cover of La Fouine's Si Maman Si. So this is a Moroccan-French raps singer who took this sort of famous French pop song, and made it into a kind of a rap tune, and it's kind of fascinating. So I did the rap version, which was completely captivating, and I recommend it highly, and you can look it up on YouTube. But the ways that there are really interesting instances in the book where Felicia talks about ways in which certain elements, either classical or sort of recent, more contemporary pop elements of French culture, are merged with hip-hop in complicated ways. And I will let her say more about it, but she describes some stagings of equal movement to emblematically French singers like Piaf and Brassens. And for me, of course, that also evoked a video, for those of you who are not necessarily based in French examples, but might have other sort of YouTube videos on the brain. The one that's immediately made me think of course, is the famous Yo-Yo Ma and Lil Buck doing Saint-Saëns The Swan, which I'm sure many of you probably saw. It was hugely viral, that video. And of course, once again, it's one of those situations where you look at this and I think that there's something very interesting about Yo-Yo Ma as an Asian American representative of classical, there were so many things going on, and there were so many things that allowed for people to sort of see a kind of something utopian, but also it's something very complicated about that video. And I was wondering if Felicia would like to say, if you would like to reflect on the differences and the similarities between the ways that some of those, I'm not even sure what term I would use, cross-multicultural representations.
Thank you. So actually, I'd really like to show another little bit of video if I can. This is going to be from the piece that Barbara's referring to, which is called Paname, which is slang, right, for Paris. And in this piece, these hip-hop dancers actually dance onto really well-known French songs, right, from a different generation. It's a little bit like the Stravinsky that I've got up here, in that Farid Berki says, Stravinsky is incredibly hip-hop. I mean, you can actually do these moves onto Stravinsky, okay? And at the same time, we obviously see there's a bow toward a kind of francophone, nostalgia, right, for la chanson française, for a certain global culture of appreciation of French music, for all this, crossing and synthetic stuff that happens. What I talked about is to think about recuperation, right? These young dancers are dancing a commissioned piece, they're going out on tour, they're touring internationally, they're representing France, right? So sometimes there is an accusation of, who are you working for here? What are you doing? What's your message? And it's interesting to me that the way that they respond, I have heard in different contexts, dancers respond or choreographers respond, no, I'm the one recuperating. I'm recuperating my town, or I'm recuperating my folks. And I find that very persuasive. So just to think about it in those terms.
Well, which kind of brings me to the place that, I'm sure there are many people who are here who are wondering about this as well. Recent events. It's been a very intense moment right now in France, and it sort of makes one want to ask the obvious question. You know, I mentioned in Randy's piece, there are all kinds of reasons to have suspicions about sort of optimism of what one can accomplish through dance. At the same time, one is looking for optimism at a moment like this. So I guess the question I would ask very, very simply is, do you think that dance can, will, should play a part in the response? And is it already happening, and what kind of effectiveness do you see?
So I should say also that you know, I'm absolutely inspired by Barbara Garney's work, and I think if there's optimism to be found, it's here. So you know, I think I agree with you, Barbara, that we like to think that dance can do things differently, and it can make a space, right, which is an alternative space for creative expression, for not just identitary, but also for self-elaboration, if you like, that it could make other things possible. So I guess I'd have to say, first, you know, yes, I hope and I think it's possible, and absolutely via dance, for some of the reasons that I hope I've started to flesh out tonight. But also I would like to bring this up in a particular way, a little more precisely, think about the French context. So I don't know how many of you were in front of your, probably all of you, like I was in front of my television a couple of weeks ago, watching everything I could see on French TV about the attacks. One of the news programs showed footage of one of the Charlie Hebdo attackers. He had been on television as a young guy, and sort of representing a hip-hop aesthetic, if you like, not dancing but rapping, and surrounded by hip-hop dancers. And for me, this was like a very low moment, right, because something that I wrote about and that I had sort of really confidence in, you know, was being shown as like, okay, you know, first step hip-hopper, right, second step terrorist, and of course, you know, the politics of this are bad. I think it would be too easy, though, to say hip-hop has failed. I think what's interesting to me is that it continues to work politically as well as artistically in the neighborhoods. So, for example, there's an association, a group called Hip-Hop Citoyen, and what do? They not only teach hip-hop, they teach hip-hop to kids, they do neighborhood events, but they really work with people on citizenship, right? So they help people move towards citizenship through artistic practice, right? One argument that gets made is, okay, but this is still just about integration, this is about just, you know, get in your lane and, you know, sign up for Republican values. Yes, okay, in some ways, but I think more and more there's going to be developing a minority politics, a minority identitary politics, maybe on the Anglo-Saxon level, maybe with a different shape, right? Maybe with a different set of discourses. But it's clearly time for that now, and I think actually hip-hop can play a major role in that. It's already doing that. One of the reasons that I write about dance is I think not only that it responds to contemporary thinking about bodies, it can really lead thinking about bodies. The way that bodies are linked to identity, right, or to all the visual, the medical, the visual, the industrial thinking that we do about what bodies produce and how they mean. Dancing doesn't just comment on that. I think it actually can offer new ways to think about how we exist bodily, right? So it's a big challenge to the notion of the visible minority, but I think it's a way forward, absolutely. I certainly hope so.
So there was one other, this book, of course, after the recent events, I was thinking a lot about your book, and I was very glad that I had read it. And there was one other book that I read recently that I highly recommend to you, which is a novel by Virginie Despentes, which is called Apocalypse Baby. And some of you may be familiar with some of her writing. She's a French feminist novelist, filmmaker, manifesto writer, etc. She's very interesting. But one of the things that happens in that, there are fans of Virginie Despentes.
I was just saying she's coming to a conference here in April, actually.
Oh yeah, well I good. Okay, well I recommend her to you. It's a really interesting novel, but one of the things that it deals with is it's about political disaffection at this particular historical moment in France, and some of it has to do with ethnicity, but some of it has to do with gender. And one of the things that my friends in France have been commenting on, and of course there's a certain fascination with this even in the press here, is the political disaffection of young women at this particular historical moment. And I won't really go into it, but one of the things that I was interested in, and I'd love to hear you talk more about, you mentioned the one young woman in the dance class who doesn't tell her family, but who's dancing. And then, of course, there are those other very powerful women dancers doing moves, and I was thinking also of the first choreography that you showed. I mean, there are interesting gender things to think about in relation to that too. Like, it's not particularly feminine movement, and there's some very. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about gender and how that interrelates to these other questions.
Well, actually, in the book, I focus on several women dancers and choreographers, and of course, they're not the majority, right? They're the exception, but also they're trailblazers, and they do also. They're maybe the most visible of a lot of women who maybe start hip hop and maybe they don't finish, right? Maybe they come in young and they don't make it all the way to company or to stage. And one reason for that is that they often come out of families where dancing is not encouraged, let's say, and they do manage to do it, right? But there were cases of hip hoppers that the study group I worked with followed, and at a certain point, for example, when they were going to get married, they stopped dancing, right? So in a way, you can think of that as constraints, whatever. But I also think there's no question that hip-hop dance, like all dance forms, is making possible for women to get out of certain mold, right, and certain expectations, etc. For what it's worth, I just want to point out that the two women that I talked about here both have 2 kids and continue to dance and continue to do their creative work. And I have only one, and it's enough for me, and I'm not dancing anymore. So I'm extremely impressed by that and by the politics of that. I also just want to talk briefly about Yifun Chen, who I showed you, who's an incredible dancer. And just 2 things very briefly. One is that she mentioned to me that this book really made a difference to her. I usually write about people who have died. I mean, dance history, for dance scholars, dancers are never dead, right? I defy you to tell me that Josephine Baker is dead, right? But, the reality is I have been writing about dancers who are no longer with us. And to write about dancers who are alive is a completely different thing. And one reason for that is that you can have more interaction with them, and you can actually also, do things for them. Yifun said to me, "It's unbelievable what this book means to my mother." Okay, that my mother gets it now, right? She takes it seriously. She doesn't say all the time, "You've got to stop this," right? So I love that story. But also, when I saw her most recently last year, what was I hearing from her? I was hearing struggle. I was hearing all of the typical struggle of every immigrant family. That we're thinking about these days. We're thinking in particular about the situation in France. That it's not just discourse, right? That there isn't the same access, there isn't the same opportunity, there isn't the same equality, and it really does, take its toll. So this fantastic artist, doesn't have the time, the funding, and the opportunity to do the work that she can do. In spite of the fact that I praise Europe, I praise the funding programs, I praise the respect which is shown for dance, right? These are still, she's still representing, that struggle of the immigrant community. So I was very moved by that when I saw her last.